Hi everybody, this is AJ speaking. This video is about answering the following question. Is it a good idea to buy AMD over Nvidia? I'll be walking you through AMD's key financial metrics and we'll compare them with Nvidia's, and then at the end of the presentation we'll be looking at some valuation metrics to find out whether AMD is cheap right now or Nvidia relative to AMD is expensive. I will not be using in this presentation a forward-looking metric. It's all based on historic numbers as reported by both companies. There are absolutely zero adjustments on my part, so this provides a fully objective picture without any third-party assumptions. However, as I said in other videos before, valuation is always forward-looking. However, a historical review of implied metrics is helpful to understand the trading history of a specific stock. For example, if you find that a stock was vastly overvalued in its history, this is relevant information. In a future video, I will be discussing how you can use this knowledge. But now let's dive right in. Here on this first chart, you see AMD's revenue development quarter by quarter. The currently latest available quarter is the first quarter of 2025. AMD delivered $7.4 billion in total revenue. That number is up year on year almost 36%. But sequentially so compared to the last quarter, down almost 3%. But when you look at this chart, you can see that the first quarter is typically a weak quarter relative to the fourth quarter. You can see that last year, first quarter was down 11%, and then the prior year, the first quarter was down 4.4%. So this year's decline at only 2.9% is actually less than in previous quarters. So here on this next slide, we make the first comparison with Nvidia. You can see that back in the second quarter of 2022, both companies had approximately the same revenue. However, subsequently, the development was vastly different. So Nvidia in the first quarter of 2025 delivered 5.9 times AMD's total revenue. Down here in this area, you see the market value currently of Nvidia and AMD. Nvidia is at 4.2 trillion and AMD is at 252 billion, which implies that Nvidia is valued 16.5 times more than AMD. You might be looking right now at these total revenue numbers and say, oh, Nvidia must be totally overvalued versus AMD, just on this revenue observation. But I recommend to hold your horses because there are some other important things that show up in this presentation later. But first, let's take a quick look at AMD's business. So AMD has four main segments. One is data center, second one is client, third one is gaming, and fourth one is embedded. In this presentation, to keep it short and sweet, I will not dive into each segment, but just have a look at this chart. This breaks down, first of all, each segment's revenue development, the year-on-year growth rate, and also the percent contribution to total revenue. And what you can see is that in the first quarter of 2025, 49% of total revenue was provided by the data center revenue. So data centers are also very important to AMD. But then there was also a 31% contribution from the client segment, and then the two other segments have minor contributions with 9 and 11% each, respectively. You can also see that in the first quarter relative to the fourth quarter and the third quarter of last year, the data center segment's revenue contribution has actually decreased. So the all-time highest contribution from data centers was achieved in the third quarter of 2024 at 52%, subsequently reduced to 50% and now 49% in the first quarter of 2025. So now on this next slide, we compare just data center revenue in AMD and Nvidia, and here the difference between the two companies is even larger. So in the first quarter of this year, in 2025, Nvidia generated 10.6 times the data center revenue AMD generated. I repeat, Nvidia is 10.6 times larger than AMD in data centers. The second key observation here is that this outperformance has basically quite steadily grown over the years. If we go back a couple of years, in the third quarter of 2023, the two companies were broadly similar. In data centers, Nvidia's data center revenue was only 1.2 times that of AMD. But then that number in just 6-7 quarters increased to 3.3 times AMD's, and since then has grown explosively, while AMD's data center revenue saw relative to Nvidia only a relatively modest growth. You can also simplify this and you can just say Nvidia sells 10 to 1 relative to AMD, And when you see such a massive outperformance, because keep in mind, customers are not forced to buy from Nvidia. There was more AMD product available, so you need to ask yourself, why did customers choose Nvidia over AMD? But this is not the point of this video, so we move on now. So this slide shows you the gross profit development, and what you can see is, so first of all, what is gross profit? You take revenue and you deduct all the costs that was necessary to provide those products. I'm simplifying slightly, and the resulting amount is your gross profit. Gross profit is critically important because it serves one to cover all your operating expenses, and then also then provide earnings, obviously. So gross profit in the first quarter of 2025 was quite strong, grew 46% year on year to the second highest ever reported of 3.7 billion. So how does this compare with Nvidia? Nvidia had a material one-off item in the first quarter, but let's ignore it for a second. Nvidia's gross profit was 7.1 times larger than AMD's. What about margins? AMD's margins have seen a multi-quarter steady improvement, you might say, or multi-year improvement at this point, and reached in the first quarter a long-term first quarter high of 50.2%. How does this compare with Nvidia? Here again, Nvidia significantly outperforms AMD in terms of margin. Nvidia's gross margin, despite the severe impact from the Q1 one-off item, was still 20% above AMD's, even though AMD is near record highs. Nvidia's in a very weak quarter in terms of margin was still significantly higher. And when you look at this analysis, in most quarters, Nvidia's gross margin is just in a completely different league. The important point about gross margin is that the higher the margin, the more valuable each dollar of revenue is. Because after you pay for the cost that you had to incur to produce the revenue, you have more cents left than a competitor with a lower margin. So next we look at operating profits. Operating profit is just gross profit less all the operating expenses. Operating expenses comprise research and development, marketing, general and administrative expenses. In AMD's case, this is a very important point. It also includes very large amortization of intangibles. So very quick, what is this? AMD a couple of years ago made a very large acquisition, and it's in technology companies, it often happens that when one company buys another company, they pay significantly above the fair value of the identifiable assets. That delta is then put on a balance sheet and is amortized. Amortization is basically the same as writing something off. So AMD many years ago spent the cash. So this amortization, just like depreciation charges, is a non-cash accounting entry. So it just kind of depresses AMD's numbers, and that's why it's so important that when you analyze AMD, you always need to look at adjusted numbers, and you need to back out that amortization charge. Otherwise, you come to completely nonsensical valuation metrics. So if we now look at this operating profit, and again, keep in mind, there are very large amortization charges baked into these numbers. So this chart is kind of pointless, to be honest, but still for good order, I'm showing operating profit. That's why we move fairly quickly on. Again, here the comparison with Nvidia. Nvidia's operating profit is fairly clean, but unfortunately AMD's isn't. That's why I highlighted here big in red. This is not that meaningful before we strip out amortization charges, so we move on quick. Here again, operating margin as reported, again, this is not that meaningful. It's quite low compared to Nvidia. You see this on this chart, but again, we're not going to dive into this because these numbers are not that relevant because of this large item in AMD's case. Now we get to an item that is highly relevant. So this is adjusted net income. So adjusted net income, I put down here the sort of how you get to it. You start with net income, so the bottom line of the P&L, and then you add back or subtract certain items. The most important add backs is share-based compensation. Then, very importantly, in AMD's case, this amortization item of intangibles is being added back, and then a bunch of smaller, not that material items, and this gives you then the non-GAAP net income. And this is for the first time after gross profit a clean metric that we can use. So this is now much more interesting. So in the first quarter of 2025, AMD generated $1.57 billion in adjusted net income. That number is up 55% year on year. It's 12% down sequentially from the fourth quarter. But as I mentioned earlier, in AMD's business model, there is some first quarter cyclicality. Plus there were some one-offs. So now it becomes really interesting. Now we compare AMD with Nvidia, all based on adjusted net income. So it is an apples to apples comparison. And you can see that in the first quarter of 2025, Nvidia outperformed AMD by 13x, so had 13 times larger adjusted net income. And very important point here, as I mentioned before, first quarter saw and Nvidia reflected a very large one-off item in relation to the H20 ban, which was just recently lifted, and Nvidia did not remove it from adjusted net income, meaning it's fully reflected, and this is why in this chart you see that this curve is going down a little bit. Otherwise, it would keep going up very quickly. So in reality, if you did this on a normalized basis, which you should, but again, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, I did not touch any of these numbers. But if you made proper adjustments, you would see that Nvidia would likely generate almost 15 times more adjusted net income than AMD, and that's why I always show down here the valuation comparison between Nvidia and AMD. Nvidia is 16.5 the value of AMD, but look, it's generating 14-15 times the earnings. So you already see there isn't a huge valuation delta. So on this next slide, we touch on another very important consideration. So what's the profitability? Again, the more profitable a company, the more valuable each incremental dollar of revenue. And in AMD's case, the adjusted net income margin, again, this metric removes this annoying amortization of intangibles. So this is a clean metric that we can use. You can see that in the first quarter, AMD generated 21% margin. If you now look at this chart, you can see that Nvidia's margin is more than double AMD's margin, and again, this is including this large one-off negative in Nvidia's case. And so when you look at the prior quarters, it's closer to 2.4 times. So this huge profitability delta is a direct result of Nvidia's much larger scale. Even though, as you see on this slide, Nvidia spends over 2 times AMD's R&D. So this, I think, is really an important slide, and one we should briefly pause on. Think about it. Nvidia is fully focused on data centers. AMD, obviously, too. Nvidia spends over 2x. Given the historic performance of these two companies, you have to be very aggressive if you think that in AMD's case, $1 of R&D goes further than in Nvidia's case. I think you would be better advised to assume that it's probably somewhat similar, and of course, key talent can consume outrageous comp packages. But the point I'm trying to make is, given the track record of these companies, their respective leaders who across this entire time period we just looked at were the same. So this is Jensen Huang at Nvidia and Lisa Su at AMD, who are, I'm not joking, cousins, by the way. How likely do you think it is that all of a sudden, after Nvidia outperformed so massively for so long, AMD all of a sudden manages to generate a higher innovation rate in AMD? Sure, it's possible, but I think the probability based on what has been delivered is rather low. So then let's look at implied valuation multiples. So this chart shows you LTM PE. So LTM is very simply the trailing or the last 12 months reported earnings per share, and then you divide the share price on a given day by the last 12 months earnings per share, and this is the chart you get. Just a few little side notes. So this chart, because when there is a new quarter reported, you often have jumps a bit from one earnings number to the next. This chart is smoothing inter-quarter. This is a slightly better approach. I will discuss in a dedicated valuation video why that is. And this chart accounts for, first, of course, reporting date, and you don't want to do these charts on a financial quarter end date. This would be wrong, and accounts for the impact of earnings release. So you want, if a company reports after hours, you want to use the next day closing price, not the closing price on the day the company reports. If it's after hours, if it's before hours, a different story. So the key observations in these charts are: until as late as Q4 2024, AMD was much more expensive than Nvidia. I find this quite mind-blowing. This means that only for about 8-9 months, the market assigned a valuation comparable to Nvidia, even though Nvidia had this phenomenal track record. So that the market got it completely upside down. You want to assign a higher valuation level to a higher quality name, not to a lower quality name. And based on what has been delivered, objectively, Nvidia was the much higher quality name. However, since about late 2024, Nvidia got slightly ahead in terms of implied LTM valuation and is now slightly more expensive than AMD. And the latest numbers imply that Nvidia trades at an LTM multiple of 46.7 times right now, and AMD at 42.5 times. So now the big question is, so what's the better investment? I'm not giving trading advice, so you need to make up your own mind. But my view is, number one, you're most of the time much better off with the market leader in a new field. The new field is making AI factories. Nvidia's track record is absolutely stellar. AMD's is strong too, but it does measure up with Nvidia's. Third, leadership for a long time. Both companies have the same leaders. Jensen clearly did a phenomenal job at Nvidia. Lisa probably too, but she simply couldn't compete with Jensen. So based on that, it's also more likely that Jensen will continue to outcompete her. The current valuation based on these metrics imply there is not a huge price delta. So the bottom line is it worth to gamble on a distant second who is at risk of becoming a third or fourth in the market? My view is it's not worth it. But let's see what's going to happen. AMD reports in just about 3 weeks. I'll be sharing a timely financial deep dive in AMD's numbers at that point, which I will be posting to my subscribers on X. So if you like this type of research, I highly recommend you follow me on X or even consider subscribing to my research. Thanks for listening. See you in the next one. Bye.